You're listening to Maneuvering Mondays, a podcast about transforming work culture. In this first part of the episode, we follow the fictional story of Marie, who's an HR manager in the edtech company Zebra Apps, as she maneuvers the challenges of transforming their work culture.
Mark was insistent. Mark, Paul, and Mary were to spend a full day together at a hotel by the seaside. They would have only one item on the agenda: Museum of Failure. Mary was sitting in the parking lot of the hotel. Her hands were still clutching the steering wheel, even though she had already turned off the engine. A part of her still felt like there was time to turn the key and drive away. What good could come of this, she thought to herself. She sighed. But she had herself facilitated stuck teams out of dysfunction as a consultant. She had just never imagined that she would be part of a team that was stuck. And when it came to Paul, she was stuck. There's no way he's going to open up to any form of constructive collaboration, Mary thought. And Mark was never going to be able to facilitate a constructive dialogue. She fished out her phone from her bag. There was one person, Mary thought, that would think this is a good idea. Anne was the first contact on her list. "Hi, Mary," Anne said. "Hi," Mary said. Anne said nothing. Mary suddenly didn't know what to say. Mary tried again. "Where are you?" Anne asked. "In my car," Mary said. "Is it driving or are you parked?" Anne asked. "It is parked," Mary said. "What is it parked in front of?" Anne asked. "A hotel," Mary said. "The one we always do our corporate retreats at." "I see," Anne said. "And why are you sitting in your car instead of going inside to your corporate retreat?" "It's Paul," Mary said. "And Mark." "Just the three of you?" Anne asked. "We're doing a Museum of Failure," Mary said. "And what is that?" Anne asked. "That is where we talk about mistakes we have made and what we have learned from them," Mary said. "So that is why you're sitting in your car," Anne said. "You don't know where to begin," Anne smirked. Mary rolled her eyes. "No," she said. "I just don't want to be the only one." "The only one to share?" Anne asked. "Yes," Mary said. Anne was quiet. Mary started regretting having called her in the first place. "Mary," Anne said. "Yeah," Mary said. "You need to start small," Anne said. "You have dug deep trenches. Today will solve nothing, whatever it is you have planned, but maybe it can be the very beginning of solving it." Mary could feel her shoulders drop. "And you shouldn't share anything you don't want to share," Anne said. "It needs to be a give and take between the three of you. You cannot fix it, you cannot solve it, but you can reciprocate." Mary let go of the steering wheel with the one hand that was still holding on. "What would be one thing that you could share?" Anne asked. "What would be one thing that you could share?" Anne asked. "I could share about the cinnamon buns," Mary said. Anne laughed. "The ones you dropped down the staircase?" Anne asked. "Yeah, that's when I met you and Simon in the coffee shop," Mary said. "That seems like a safe thing to share," Anne said. "I don't know," Mary said. "My team was pretty judgmental about it." "Why is that?" Anne asked. "'Cause I left them for 3 days," Mary said. Anne laughed a roaring laughter. "That is perfect," Anne said. Mary smiled. "Do you think there is hope?" Mary asked. "For you and Paul," Anne said. "Yes." Mary unbuckled her seatbelt, thanked Anne, and went inside. Paul was pouring himself a cup of coffee when Mary found him at the breakfast buffet. "Good morning," she said. Paul put the thermos with the coffee down on the table and turned around. His eyes were puffy and he was pale. "Good morning, Mary," he said. He extended his hands towards Mary. Mary shook it. "So formal this morning," Mary said. Paul shrugged and picked up his coffee cup. "How is the hearing going?" Mary asked. Paul shook his head. Don't mention it, he said. Late night yesterday? Mary asked. It's late night every night these days, Paul said. And now Mark wants to take a full day out to dust off the skeletons. Mary smirked. Is that how he explained it? Mary asked. What did he tell you? Paul asked. That we're going to do the Museum of Failure exercise together, Mary said. Paul narrowed his eyes. I already knew that you left a bag of cinnamon buns at the bottom of the stairwell for 2 weeks, he said, with a gentle smile on his face. Mary laughed. Wait a minute now, it was only 1 week, she said. Paul laughed. I never pictured you as a person who would overlook something like that, he said. You're always perfect. I am far from perfect, Mary said. And these days I'm finding out the magnitude of things that I have been overlooking, like whatever is happening with Frank's court case. You know I can't really discuss that, Paul said. But is there anything I should be catching with Andrea? Mary asked. Anything we need to do to keep her safe or motivated to stay on? Let's focus on getting her a fair hearing in court, Paul said. Mary was balancing her coffee cup and plate with fruit as she was making her way to the conference room. Paul was still picking out his breakfast. I can't really use the bun incident again to share, Mary thought to herself. What else can I share without feeling like I'm revealing too much? Then Mary noticed that the hallway was decorated with pictures of Ukrainian families. When the war started, Ukrainian refugees were quartered in the hotel temporarily, but the hotel had taken responsibility for the families it housed. And had hired multiple of the new arrivals. The pictures chronicled the lives of the families and how they have been building a life in their adopted country. Several pictures were showing the Ukrainian flag, either wrapped around people or as blue and yellow streamers glued around the frame. This made Mary think back to the flower party at Allie's kindergarten, and how she had forgotten to buy streamers because she spent the afternoon with Anne instead. That would be safe to share, Mary thought to herself. Mark was already in the conference room. He had put up a grey-brown sheet of cardboard on the wall and written the rules of the Museum of Failure exercise on the whiteboard. The tables in the room were pushed aside along the walls, so there was an open floor space in the middle. Is that from the bottom of the stairwell? Mary asked. Mark looked at her standing in the entrance. Joe gave this to me, Mark said. And good morning. Then probably it is, Mary said. That is where she finds all of her supplies. She helped me plan for this day, Mark said. Mary frowned her eyebrows. What? Mark asked. You didn't tell me that you would ask her to help you, Mary said. Mark smiled. You know that she ultimately works for me, Mark said. Mary could feel her eyebrows crawling all the way to the top of her forehead. She clenched her teeth and walked towards one of the tables to put her breakfast down. Paul entered the room. Good morning, he said. Great, we're all here, Mark said. You have forgotten the meat, Paul said. Mary laughed. Mark looked down at the carpet. I didn't think it was appropriate this early in the morning, he said. How will we celebrate our mistakes then? Mary asked playingly, looking over at Paul. He met her gaze with a smile. Joe said that there are no rules, Mark said, that we can decide what counts as a celebration. Is this really the only thing we have on our agenda today? Paul asked, looking at Mark. Yes, Mark said with a smile. Today we are digging out all the corpses. Not only do we have skeletons, but corpses too, Mary said. You can just force it, Paul said. Mark was about to say something, but Mary interjected. Digging out all the corpses is a little ambitious, Mary said. Maybe let's aim for getting a little bit closer aligned. Completely agree, Paul said. Mary looked at Paul. This is the most agreeing the two of them had ever done. And she was starting to get a sense of Paul not necessarily being on the same page as Mark either. Could she and Paul be on the same side? Maybe they could extinguish some of Mark's fires before he managed to start them. Mark kicked off the exercise by sharing an incident where he parked in a handicap lot next to a pharmacy and found a parking ticket under his window wiper as soon as he had picked up the medicine. Now that is poor judgment, Paul said. Mary smirked. What if I told you that my then 2-year-old son was burning up with fever and my wife was going into labor that same evening? Mark said, his pupils dilating. Paul froze for a moment. I would have done the same exact thing, Mary said. Me too, Paul said quietly. Mark sat down. I would not have done anything differently, Mark said. Mary looked at Paul. He was looking at the floor. How would you want to celebrate your mistake? Mary asked. It's not really a mistake, is it? Paul said. Mark looked at him. It's a calculated risk, Paul continued. Mark nodded. And an ancient one at that. Your daughter is 14 years old, Paul said. She's 13, Mark said. So you brought us to this retreat, making us take a whole day out of our calendars, Paul said, to dust off skeletons and dig up corpses, and the only thing you are sharing is a non-mistake that you did 13 years ago. Paul took a step closer towards Mark. Mark was looking at the carpet now. Mary was baffled. Her relationship with Mark was poor, but it would seem that Paul's was even worse. Now that might count as straight small, Mary said. Mark looked at her. I guess it says something about HR leadership in our company, that even the boss isn't safe enough to share anything that actually discloses any weaknesses, Mary went on. Paul threw his hands up in the air. Why can't we just do our jobs, he said. I don't have time for this bullshit. Because we're not doing our jobs, Mark said, still looking at the floor. He looked up. I know that I'm not, he said. Mary looked at Mark. Look, I got the soda fridges installed, Mark said. Why is that a mistake? Paul said. That is a perk. That is a lazy perk, Mark said. And I knew that even when I signed the work order. Mark looked at Mary first, then at Paul. I could not have known that it would push Willie over the edge and go full-on Sugargate on us, he said. But I did know that it would not lead to more employee satisfaction. Why did you do it then? Mary asked. To do something, Mark said. Anything. Paul crossed his arms. Both Esther and I had to work late for a week to figure out the tax implications of that. Both Esther and I had to work late for a week to figure out the tax implications of that, Paul said. And you are telling me that you initiated that, knowing it would not work? Mary looked at Paul. Why would it take a whole week to figure out how to tax soda? Mary asked. Paul looked at her from the bottom to the top. And you say that you can do my job, eh? He said. Mary raised her eyebrows and looked at Mark. Why did you feel like you had to do something? She asked. Because people were leaving Zebra Apps, he said, and I had noticed that. I had seen the trend for the past year, but I did not care enough to even bring it up to Natalie. Why didn't you care in the first place? Mary asked. Because it wouldn't matter anyways, Mark said. I have been fighting Natalie to focus on our culture ever since I started. She pays it lip service, but she is so afraid that the company will fail that she will jump at any commercial opportunity and will avoid financial risk at any price. Why do you stay then? Paul asked. Mark looked at Paul, then back at Mary. Because I like what we have built together, he said. He smiled. His eyes smiled. Paul, you are a seventh when it comes to contracts, taxes, and salary, he said. I never have to worry about our legal and financial platform. He then looked at Mary. And you care so deeply about our leaders and our people that you're willing to poke at any skeleton, he paused, or dig up any corpse to protect Willie. We are the best HR team I've ever worked with in my life, Mark said. Mary looked at him. He was still wearing a half smile on his face, and he had that sparkle in his eyes, like when Mary had just confronted Paul. Except that we are not a team, Paul said. Agreed, Mary said. We are the most non-team I've ever experienced in my life. That is my biggest mistake, Mark said. Not having done my job as a leader and investing in making us a team. That is why we are here today, Mark continued. To rectify my mistake, to become a team. The room went quiet for a couple of moments. Paul looked over at the brownish poster. You appear to have missed a step. Was that a bad outcome or a lapse of judgment? Paul asked with a smile on his face. Mary and Mark laughed, and they continued to complete Mark's sharing of the mistake, and toasted in coffee while shouting, "To hell with it!" Mark drew a post-it with 3 smiling stick figures on it, and added it to the poster. Paul shared how he had made a taxation error for some members of their sales team when it came to taxing their vehicles that they were allotted. Mary lost her concentration a couple of times, while Paul were explaining the intricacies of what happens when personal financial statements meet corporate reporting obligations, and when employee perks are extended to new affiliates. It did not help that Paul went into such detail that he at one point even went up to a poster on the wall and started drawing some of the transactions. To avoid similar situations, Paul had brought on an external tax advisor to help structure some of the new processes that they needed to put in place for their growing sales force. He preferred to celebrate his mistakes with high fives. They all agreed that the drawing of financial transactions was sufficient to document this mistake. After lunch, it was Mary's turn to share. Now you have all heard about my cinnamon bun adventure down the stairwell, Mary said. I've even seen your sparkling sugar shoe as evidence, Mark said. What else have you done? Paul said with a sparkle in his eye. Well, Mary said, there's this other mother at my daughter Ellie's kindergarten that would probably tell you that I'm failing as a mother. Mary intended it to be a joke, but both Paul and Mark didn't even pull a muscle. Mary suddenly felt naked. I'm not actually failing as a mother, Mary said, reassuring herself more than anything. Say more about why this other mother might think so, Paul said. Mary looked at the door. Then she looked out the window. She took a deep breath. A month ago, we had a flower party at my daughter's kindergarten. I am part of the party committee at the kindergarten, and I was supposed to bring the decorations, but I got distracted and forgot all about it, Mary said. And what happened next? Mark asked. Carrie's mom had bought the decorations herself, so even though I had forgotten them, the party went on as planned, Mary said. Why didn't she just agree to buy them in the first place, Paul asked. Because she's testing me, Mary said, and shrugged her shoulders. You see, the previous party I had forgotten to bring sprinkles for the cake. And what happened at that party? Mark asked. We lost the cake competition and Carrie's mom blames me, Mary said. Would you have won the competition had you had sprinkles? Mark asked. No way, Mary said. The cake that won was shaped like a human heart with arteries and everything. Ours was just a red velvet with white frosting. It was supposed to have red heart sprinkles on it. Mark raised his eyebrows. It did get eaten, and it was all for a good cause, Mary said. To raise money for a new playground. How did you feel about forgetting the decorations? Paul asked. Mary thought for a minute. It did make me feel like I wasn't playing my part, Mary said. Like I wasn't being a proper parent. She looked at Paul. But when I think about it, it makes no sense, Mary continued. Why should my parenting be judged by my ability to remember to bring things to parties at kindergarten? I forgot to bring my son's birthday cake to his kindergarten once, Paul said. On his actual birthday. I only remembered when we got to his classroom. The door to the classroom was decorated with flags and his picture. My heart sank. I had forgotten the cake at home on the kitchen counter, and there was no time to go back for it. We were in the middle of closing the books on the financial year at my previous company. Did you feel like a bad parent? Mary asked. Like the worst, Paul said. Even though my son didn't care at the time. He was 3. It was more the comments from the teachers at kindergarten. What did they say? Mark asked. They said things like, we all know that you have an important job. And next time, how about Felicia makes the cake arrangements? Paul said. Felicia is my wife. I hate when that happens, Mark said. I don't know how many times my kids' teachers have called my number to talk about something one of the kids has done. realize that it's my number and say, "Oh, we didn't realize it's your number, Mark. We'll try Elizabeth instead." Like I'm some second-tier parent. "That's funny," Mary said. "Something similar has happened to my husband, Thomas, several times. Despite him doing most of the kindergarten drop-offs and pickups, the teachers wait for me to drop Allie on Fridays to talk about her friendship, forgotten shoes, and whatever. It drives him mad. Even though you forget sprinkles and decorations, you are still the default parent," Mark said. "But no one expects you to volunteer for cake competitions," Mary said, looking at Mark, then Paul. "I wish they did," Paul said. "I bake the best cakes, and my wife can't even follow a recipe." Mary studied his face. But he was completely stern. "I'm serious," Paul said. "I'm a really good baker." Mark and Mary laughed. "I'll prove it to you," Paul said. "I'll bake cinnamon buns for next Friday breakfast." "You'll come to Friday breakfast?" Mary asked. "If you serve my buns, I will," Paul said. Mary extended her hand toward Paul. He shook it. "How did you get distracted?" Mark asked. Mary looked at Mark. "I mean, when you were supposed to buy decorations for Ellie's party," Mark clarified. "You usually remember everything. What made you forget to buy them?" "I had planned to buy the streamers right before the party," Mary said. "But instead, I spent the afternoon with Anne." "Anne?" Mark said with his eyes open wide. "Yeah," Mary said. Mark and Paul exchanged glances. Mark spoke first. "You have met with Anne," he said. "Yes," Mary said. "I've spoken to her several times, even this morning." "Mary," Paul said, "Anne may not have the best interests of our company in her mind." "What do you mean?" Mary asked. Paul and Mark exchanged glances again. "What?" Mary asked. "She was let go," Mark said finally. "What?" Mary said. "But why would we let her go? She has created all of our most successful products." "She was not contributing," Paul said. "Not contributing?" Mary almost shouted. "She was keeping the bloody engineering department together. It has gone completely bonkers since she has left." "She was not contributing to the harmony of zebra apps," Mark said. Mary looked at him. In her stomach, the red-hot bowl of lava was starting to boil. She clenched her teeth and could feel her hands tighten into fists. "What harmony, Mark?" she said. Mark looked at the carpet. Mary looked straight at his eyes, but he did not look up. Paul stepped in front of Mark, as if to intercept Mary's gaze. "Mary, you don't know the full picture," he said. "We let her go, but knew how it would look. We did not want the entire engineering department to walk out. Anne did not want that either. So we made an agreement with her that she would resign instead. We always expected that she would be back to meddle with the company. And now it seems like she has indeed been meddling through you." Mary suddenly felt dizzy. Was she being used by Anne? That thought turned the world upside down. But at the same time, it did not resonate with what Mary felt after interacting with Anne. She felt angry and annoyed. She thought Anne was just trying to help. Mark still wouldn't look at her. Mary sat down on one of the tables that had been pushed toward the wall next to her plate from breakfast. She took a bite out of an apple. Paul looked at Mark. "I need to be in court in 45 minutes, he said. "I don't want to be stuck in traffic." Mark nodded. Paul walked out the door. Mark drew a cake on a post-it and hung it on the poster. Then he took a picture of it with his phone. He looked at Mary. "Just be careful," he said. It was 8:30 on Monday, and Mary was standing in front of a whiteboard on wheels in the hallway of the engineering department. The lights turned off periodically in the hallway if Mary did not move. She waved her hands to reinitiate the lights and checked her watch again. 8:40. She checked her Outlook calendar on the phone. Daily Scrum was scheduled for 8:30 every morning. Daily Scrum was scheduled for 8:30 every morning. Jenny had forwarded the invitation to Mary so that she could get a better sense of what was happening in the engineering teams. Right now nothing is happening, she thought to herself. Mary took a closer look at the board. It was divided into sections. There was a section called Backlog, a section called Committed, and a Kanban board with To Do, Doing, and Done columns. There was also a Waiting For section. There were post-its in all sections of the board. Mary looked closer at the orange post-it in the Waiting For section. It said Calendar Synchronization. Wait a minute, Mary thought to herself. ASLO already integrates with all commonly used calendars. It is one of the benefits always highlighted on their sales slides. Then it dawned on Mary. This board is no longer in use. If the engineers do not meet for daily scrum here, where is it then? Mary thought as she walked down the hallway. She opened the door to one of the offices and saw 5 developers sitting at their desks with headphones on, looking into their screens. No one looked up. Mary looked around at the room. The walls were white. There was a pinboard on one of the walls. Nothing was pinned to it. The pins were organized in a square pattern in the corner, unemployed. Finally, one of the developers looked up and took his headphones off. "Hey, Mary," he said. She looked at him and recognized one of the engineers she sat next to during the town hall. "Oh, hey," she said. She looked at the tray on his desk. It said Ibrahim. "Ibrahim," she added on. He looked at the tray too and raised an eyebrow. "We are in the middle of our daily scrum," he said. Now Mary raised an eyebrow. "Staring at your screens?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "This way Jenny can listen in on any of the teams. Today she's with us." "Is that your board in the hallway?" she asked. Ibrahim looked in the direction Mary was pointing. "Yeah, or at least it was," he said. "Everything is in Jira now." "What is Jira?" Mary asked. "It's like a virtual board," he said, "that can also automate stuff." "Cool," she said. Ibrahim nodded, but his smile was stiff. "How can I join in on your daily scrum?" Mary asked. "Do you have the meeting link?" Ibrahim asked. "Yeah, Jenny forwarded it to me," she said. Jenny forwarded it to me," she said. "Then you just join from there," Ibrahim said. "But we're almost done." Mary looked at the screen. She could see Jenny's video. Jenny was muted and seemed to be typing away. Then the feed disappeared as everyone hung up. Ibrahim looked at Mary. "So you are the reason Jenny has granted us with her presence today," he said. Mary could feel the blood flowing to her face. "I guess I am," she said. "Jenny asked me to work my HR magic." Mary made air quotes. Another developer hung up. "God knows that is what we need," he said. Mary looked at him, trying to understand if he was being ironic or not. His tone had been completely flat. "Are you trying to read my tray too?" the developer asked. Ibrahim laughed. "That's Dennis," Ibrahim said. "It stings, Mary," Dennis said. "I have been in this company way longer than you have." "I'm sorry," Mary said. "I will make an effort to learn your names." "He's messing with you," Ibrahim said. Mary looked at Dennis, then back to Ibrahim. She had no idea who was messing with her, but one of them was. Dennis smiled. Then he walked over to one of the developers sitting at the window, and he started gesturing, looking at his screen. "May I ask who your Scrum Master is?" Mary asked Ibrahim. "We don't have one," Ibrahim said. "Never needed one." "I see," Mary said. "But who facilitates your ceremonies?" she asked. "When we would start at the board, no one did. We would all know the drill and get through whatever needed to be discussed," he said. "How did you know the drill?" she asked. "None of us are new in this game," he said. Then he thought for a minute. "And all of us who have been here from the beginning at least, have been taught by Richard," he said. "How do you teach new people how to participate in your ceremonies then?" Mary asked. "We don't," he said. "They pick it up eventually." Ibrahim starting to look at his screen again. Mary felt it might be time to go. "I'll try to join your daily tomorrow," she said. Ibrahim nodded. Mary was about to go, but then she turned around. "Why is everyone so quiet?" Mary asked. "Jenny wants us to be productive," Dennis said, making air quotes. That means no messy stand-ups in the hallways, the developers by the window chimed in. And everyone needs to sit at their desks and code, Ibrahim said without looking up. Mary raised both eyebrows. I see, she said. We miss Anne, Dennis said. Mary was about to ask how so, but Dennis was already deep into discussions with the developer by the window. Not being very quiet, Mary thought to herself. Did you know that our developers aren't allowed to do actual daily scrums standing at actual boards? Mary asked Eric as they were having lunch. Eric laughed and abruptly stopped when Mary's facial expression did not change. You're serious, he said. Who is not allowing them to use actual boards? They use a tool now for managing their work, Mary said. So maybe they don't miss the boards, but it was eerie quiet during their daily scrum today. That is when you're supposed to discuss all issues, Eric said. Yeah, none of the developers were saying anything, Mary said. And Jenny attended their daily scrum. What? Eric said. Yeah, Mary said. That is really not the point with self-managing teams if the manager, in this case even executive, hangs around in the team's meetings. Who will dare air their dirtiest laundry if your manager is there? Eric said. I wonder if all the teams are like this, Mary said. You can try asking Willie if the hardware team is any different, Eric suggested. Mary put her knife and fork on her plate. You know, I think I will, she said. She got up with her tray and left Eric to finish lunch on his own. Mary found Willie in the break room near the data center. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot. Hey, Willie, Mary said. Willie looked up. Hey, Mary, he said. What are you doing in my dungeon? Is it a dungeon now? She said with a giggle. This is where they send us criminals to work the mines, he said, smiling. You're in a giddy mood, Mary said. Willie smiled. I'm just happy that I still have a job, he said, after the stunt that I pulled. I must say that your so-called stunt took some creativity from your side to pull off, she said. I'm not sure we have put you in a position to use all the creative energy you are lugging around. Willie looked at Mary straight in the eyes and smiled from ear to ear. I did want to become a performance artist when I was a kid, he said. What kind of performances? Mary asked. Any kind, really, Willie said. I'm a solid tap dancer and have done theater and sang in a band in my youth. Why didn't you pursue it professionally? Mary asked. My parents died when I was young and I lived with my grandparents in the countryside, he said. I got myself into some trouble out of pure boredom, I think, and got sent to prison for a while. Mary's eyes widened. The janitorial job I got here at Zebra was my first real job when I got out, he said. I had no idea, Mary said. This was before your time, Willie said. But Richard took a big chance on me back in the day. It helped me sort out my life and get back to the straight and narrow. Mary just looked at him, not quite knowing what to say. Getting to study hardware and being promoted to a hardware engineer was a huge step up for me, Willie continued. Never mind not being able to use my creativity. It doesn't have to stop here, though, Mary said. We need all of your skills to come out. Well, I don't see a need for many sugar stunts in our corporate life, he said. Mary laughed. But we might need some ideas for marketing happenings, she said. Willie smiled again. But Willie, the reason I came down here was to ask about the daily scrums in the engineering teams, she said. You mean the ones we don't have anymore? He said with a shrug. The ones that are pure performance theater? How do you mean? She asked. I told you that engineers are close to breaking point, he said. Have you not heard about the quality issues we have been having with ASLO? No. What quality issues? She asked. The ones that have been forcing our ratings down and filling our call center queues with customer complaints, he said. What is happening with ASLO? She asked. We are not talking about what is happening with ASLO, Willie said. No daily scrums means no issues are discussed or resolved. How long has this been happening? Mary asked. Ever since Anne left, he said. Anne compensated for Jenny's stupid virtual daily scrum policy by talking to each of us individually. She made sure that information still traveled between the different teams, even though we were not allowed to meet up and discuss problems anymore. That's why she was in meetings all the time, and that is why she quit. No one person can compensate for corporate stupidity. Mary's eyes moved from side to side. "But why aren't you allowed to meet in the first place?" she asked. Willie smirked. "You asked Jenny that," he said. He looked at Mary in the eyes again. "And do it quick," he said, "before you have a mutiny on your hands."
You're listening to Maneuvering Mondays, a podcast about transforming work culture. Tune in when we invite guests to comment on this part of Marie's journey. What are your thoughts on Marie's situation? Have you had a similar experience? And what would you have done? Join the conversation on our LinkedIn page and let's maneuver Mondays together.